وإنك لعلى خلق عظيم فستبصر ويبصرون.
Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalam ala rasulillah wa alihi sahbihi ajma'in. Thumma amma ba'd, a'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim, bismillahir rahmanir rahim. So, just continuing on in the life of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and last week we talked about the sacrilegious war, what this was, what was the cause of this, and who was involved, and the two tribes which were of the Quraysh and Ta'if, which were getting together. And we left last week's session where the two tribes actually got together and the two armies met because they're about to go to war over this, over this murder that was committed by Barad of the Quraysh of the Banu Kanana tribe, and he killed, um, he killed Urwa from the Ta'if tribe of Hawazin, and so this just led up to, this conflict was building up where these two armies were actually meeting in the battlefield. So what actually happens next? So So the armies end up meeting, and there's a bit of a what happens is there's a bit of a stalemate, and they basically have a little bit of a standoff. So you can imagine, these are two, like we said, two big tribes, and they have like the strong armies. There's a bit of a stalemate, and what happens is there's some negotiations. So they kind of stopped. There's some negotiations between the two tribes, and some negotiations start to take place. And neither tribe really wants to have a full-scale war. Why? Because they realize what's at stake. Like these are two very, very big tribes, and like centers of business. Like at Taif. Taif was considered a vacation spot. Like this is a vacation spot. It's a mountain town. Everybody went for holiday in Taif, and even when you go there today, Taif, like it has nice weather. It's like a mountain. It has mountains and valleys. It has very nice scenery and things like that. So Taif is a vacation spot. And these two tribes have met their armies. These two armies have met, and the Quraysh are from Makkah, and Hawazin are from Taif, and they weren't really interested in getting involved in any like full-scale war. When the two armies met, and the Quraysh, on the other hand, it's the center of business. Like they're the keepers of the Haram. They host thousands of people all over from Arabia for the Hajj every single year. So they're two big tribes, and everybody knows about these two places. So there's a bit of a standoff at that time. So we know this happened even before Islam, right? And the Hajj still took place, and we know this even though there were idols there. So they weren't really interested in getting into a situation like fighting together. So it's as if they just kind of stopped. When the two armies met, they just kind of stopped. They set up camp with each other. So what ends up happening? So what happens was this conflict, like we were talking about last week, this conflict was a 5-year conflict. And the narrations go on to say that this conflict lasted for 5 years. And this standoff is like something, like you may have done this in history in school. It's very similar to, for example, if you remember the Cold War, you may have done this in history, the Cold War. What was the Cold War? This was a political rivalry between two superpowers of the time, between the United States, between America, and between the Soviet Union that developed after World War II. So there's like these two superpowers, and soldiers of these two countries never actually did battle. They never, if you search up the Cold War, if you study this in history, the soldiers of these two superpowers, the US and Soviet Union, they never actually did battle directly. Rather, it was sort of like a chess game. They created like a hostile environment through politics, spying, media, propaganda, building up weapons to show each other's strength, build up weapons, financial aid, even wars. They did wars against other nations, but they never fought against each other. This is the Cold War. They were intelligent enough to realize, wait a minute, hang on, these are two superpowers. This is the US and Soviet Union. And obviously Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore, but they're two superpowers. They don't really want to fight each other. There's no guarantee that we're going to come out on top. So similarly, here we have two major tribes of Arabia. We have the Quraysh, the Banu Kanana of Quraysh, and Hawazin from Ta'if, the two biggest cities of Arabia, Makkah and Ta'if. So it's just like two major nations, just like that, standing off against each other, facing off against each other. Sometimes like you see two cats coming and about to fight, but what they actually do, they sort of stand off and face off. They don't really fight. They just weigh each other up. This is what happened. This standoff. So it was a standoff against each other, and they didn't really engage in warfare, in any type of warfare. There's no battle that took place. So this was type of a Cold War, like was set up, and they had the situation for about 5 years. So the question is, was there any fighting in this time? In these 5 years, There's only 5 days of fighting. 5 days of fighting in 5 years. So 5 days of fighting. And what's very interesting is that these narrations mention that there are only 5 days of actual fighting. And at this time, during the 5 days, just going now, just moving on to the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. So obviously he's in this situation, right? He's living there at this time. How old was the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam when the 5 days of fighting started? At this time, the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, he was an older teenager. So maybe he's about 17, maybe 18. So we said that the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam was 15 when this conflict started. And after 3 more years, that's when the 5 days of fighting started. Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam is 18 years old at this time. He's an older teenager. During those 5 years, there's only 5 days in which battle actually took place between the armies in the whole of the 5 years. And in fact, these days are marked in history. And because imagine for 5 years, you have a major standoff between two nations, between two superpowers. Just like nowadays, imagine if you have the US and Russia or the US and China, you know, have a standoff for 5 years, even though, these they think the superpowers obviously they only have a certain time before they're going to come down, but they're not really. But the so-called superpowers. So just imagine if there was 5 years of like a standoff between like the two major so-called superpowers of the world at the moment. So even in those 5 days, in the whole of 5 years, fighting took place between two tribes, and these 5 days were given names. So what were the names of the 5 days that fighting took place? Number one, the first day was Yom Shamta. Yom Shamta. Yom is day. Shamta is the name given to the first day. The second day is Yom Abla. Abla. That's the second day. Shamta, Abla. That's the second day. Now, both of these days of battle, the first 2 days, the first and second day, happened near a place called Ogad. Ogad. So the first 2 days happened near a place called Ogad, which is an area just outside Makkah, where you had major markets used to take place, festivals, festivals used to happen in this place, just outside Makkah, and this place was called Ogad. The 2 days of battle, the first 2 days, Yom Shamta, Yom Abla, it took place in Ogad. Right. The third day of the fighting is called Yom Shard. Yom Shard. Shard. Now this day, the third day, is the most fiercest day of battle, right? So just remember, the third day was the most fiercest day of battle. This is called Yom Shard, the day of Shard. And this is where the most of the battle, the fiercest fighting was on the third day. There's only 5 days, and the third day had the fiercest fighting. And this is called Yom Shard. And after that, there were a couple of more days where battle took place, where fighting took place, basically. So these were the 5 days of fighting. So the most fiercest fighting happens on the third day. Just imagine, one day in all of 5 years is where the fiercest fighting happens in this so-called in this war, like Cold War, where there's this major standoff between two massive tribes. So now, before we talk about the role, the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, like what did he do during this time of war, the conflict? It's quite interesting. We're just going to mention at this time what was going on with the people in Makkah, like what feelings were developing at the time of war. So, like at any war, during the time of any war, there's certain sentiments, there's certain like propaganda going around. So what was happening in Makkah at this time? So what was the situation? So what was the situation? At this time, there's certain feelings developed. Like, we said the Prophet ﷺ was like 14, 15 when the war started. And this continued throughout the late teens of the Prophet ﷺ. So much like people who grow up, like in similar situations, when there's tensions between countries, like, these feelings are developed. Like, for example, in Gaza, in Palestine, what's happening at the moment, with the continued terrorist attacks of the Zionist state, the massacre that the Zionist state is doing, even though the situation, you can't compare this to like the Sacrilegious War, that was like the Cold War where there wasn't really much fighting. But even then, just imagine young children now who are growing up in the situation, like in Gaza, they will have a certain mindset in life because this is going to influence their thoughts, right? Their mindset is going to change for the rest of their life. You with me? Because they experience these horrors every single day. And even, as we talk about the Cold War when it happened, the United States, there was very interesting culture at the time. Like at that time, and even, this is like a general thing now, which you can apply this to any war, any conflict. There's media. Media always spreads lies, right? You know this. The media spreads lies, right? The media is like a lying machine. Through propaganda, through people, through the media, people are made to think a certain way. Like it creates a mindset for people that grow up at that time. they think a certain way. So, going back to the Cold War in the US, there was like a media campaign and they had this mentality that the Soviet Union, you know, they're terrible. Like, even look at Russia and Ukraine. They've got this, the media's given us a mindset that, Russia, they're terrible. You have to support Ukraine. This is just media, just putting lies in your head, right? So, the certain way, they're even in the Cold War, like we're saying, the Soviet Union, they do so many, they were like, had really negative press. So it's like it's influencing the people who are growing up. The media is influencing them how to think. And this is though, and how are they doing this? Especially in America, they're doing this through, entertainment. So if you are aware of what goes on, so through movies, through entertainment, through like the film industry, through like like the media, uh, through movies, they paint a certain picture about the other side. It's quite subtle. It's quite, if you just look at what goes on, it's like a whole media machine. They paint a certain picture against other people, and they portray themselves as, what we do is just the right thing. They justify their actions. So the Prophet ﷺ is growing up during this time when he sees a standoff between the two major tribes, Hawazin and Banu Kanana of Quraysh. And there's a lot of, another thing is there's a lot of, what else is the media? We'll talk about what the media was at that time, but there's what else is spreading? There's nationalism spreading, right? Nationalism is spreading like pride. Give your allegiance, back your tribe, back your family. You stick with them, no matter whether they're doing right or wrong. Like nationalism, like borders. Countries have borders, right? So the media, this is being spread at the time of the sacrilegious war, the Harbul Fajar, is like this concept is being spread that you have to back your tribe. And what is the media at that time? What was the media at the time? We talked about this at the time, the Prophet ﷺ now growing up. What was the entertainment media so powerful? Obviously, they don't have TV and social media. It was poetry, right? Poetry. The poets were spreading nationalism, tribalism, like this gang type mentality, like you have to back your tribe, you have to stand up for your tribe, just back them whatever happens. And we know this is wrong, right? And at this time, the media was spreading this, the poets were spreading this. The Prophet ﷺ was reflecting at this time. He was reflecting, and what was he reflecting about? So he was reflecting, the Prophet ﷺ was growing up, becoming a man. He was in his late teens. He was basically becoming a man. He grew up during that time. And the Prophet ﷺ was able to kind of sit back because of his own nature. But the Prophet ﷺ was very mature, right? For his age, like just imagine a 17, 18-year-old, right? You're not very mature, but the Prophet ﷺ was very mature for his age. He's very thoughtful, he's intelligent, he's reflective, he used to think a lot about things. And he didn't have a lot of interest in these type of things which are going on. He would often go to he would not even go to these festivals. Like in Ogad, we talked about festivals that used to happen. He would not even go to these places, like we've even said before, because he didn't approve of the things they were doing. Like they were not just worshipping idols, they were like drinking, partying, singing, dancing. The Prophet ﷺ would not approve of these things. Prophet ﷺ, he didn't have an interest in these things. In fact, he hated these things, right? So he would often stay back from these festivals, these social, these gatherings where they would do wrong and evils. And he would look at them and it made a big impression in the life of the Prophet ﷺ. He didn't approve of these practices, and he would often be in deep thought, like reflecting as a young man, how to avoid these things. Like, how can we stop these things from happening in our society? Like these bad things happening. How can we stop these evils? Like, how can we stop the wrongs and the evils in the culture? He used to think about this. The Prophet ﷺ, so he's growing up at this time, if you can just picture, of this war going on, right? So he's been there from the age of 15, now it's 18, he's at the age of 18. He can see what's happening. He can see this war is happening. And he can see the impact of the war what is it having on society, what the impact of the war is on people, on their mentality. And he sees this negative influence on people. He sees the media, the poets, portraying a certain picture, backing your tribe, nationalism, backing your country, backing the borders, no matter what they're doing. And similarly, this nationalistic pride, right? This pride in your tribe that was being spread widespread, because obviously think that's the only way people are going to get really motivated. Yes, I'm going to fight for the Banu Kanana. I'm going to fight for the Hawazin because it's my tribe. No matter what, I need to fight for them. This mentality that the poets are spreading, he sees this. The Prophet ﷺ is seeing this, and he sees this as a problem. And the other thing to note is the education of the Prophet ﷺ. So just imagine, well, just think about this. Nowadays, like when you're from 15 years old, all you guys who are going to school, college, when you're 15 years old, all the way up to 20, that's like the prime time for education, isn't it? Like that's when you're doing growing up in the system we're in. You do GCSEs, you do A levels, most probably you start working, maybe go to university, you go college or you do an apprenticeship. Or in these 5 years, 15 to 20, this is a key time for your education, growing up. And put yourself in the shoes of the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. When he was 15, then 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, all this time, what was the main education the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam was getting at this time? It was the war going on. It was a sacrilegious war going on, right? The Harb al-Fijar. That's his education. That's he's seeing what's happening around him. This inappropriate war, right? This inappropriate, like unjust war is spreading nationalism. Like we live and die for the country. Islam is opposed to this, right? Islam doesn't put borders and passports in place. This is something which happened afterwards. Like the history. This is tribalism, and this tribalism was being spread at that time when the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, nationalism was being spread when he's growing up. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is giving the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam an amazing practical education. And and the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam has come when he's a prophet, messenger, he will end this very system that he's living in. And this is what Islam mainly came to do, right? To end the social evils, the injustices. This would be removed when nationalism and tribalism, when this is abolished. When that goes, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is showing the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam the ugliness of the system. And just talking a bit about this corrupt system, which I'm sure that you're aware of as well. When you talk about the system is corrupt, people say, so what? What does that do? Well, you can see examples of this today as well. Like you can see the ugliness of the system nowadays as well, right? You can see this. So, like, for example, what is this? Like, we're living in times of Jahiliyyah. If you think about it, at the moment, the times we're living in is the times of Jahiliyyah. It's the time when there's borders between countries, there's nationalism. The West has enforced this, right? After the World War, because of the weakness, mainly because of the weakness of the Muslims, these borders and nationalism has been forced. And it was to do with the loss of Iman of the Muslims. When the Iman levels go down, Muslims have broken apart and split apart. And this system is very ugly because you see, the borders are put around the Muslim world now. There's Muslim countries, and Muslims are being massacred by the terrorists, like what's going on in Gaza at the moment. But the world doesn't care. It turns a blind eye because of the borders and nationalism. Because the other countries and Muslims, they say, yeah, it's nothing to do with us. That's a different country. We just mind our own business. We're a separate tribe, right? Forget justice. We look after ourselves only. And that's the mentality at the moment. Think about it. It's big similarity of the time we are in now to the time of Jahiliyyah, this tribal time, the time before the message, before Islam spread. And there's no decent person, for example, can become a prime minister nowadays of a country because they're going to be removed by, by the so-called, by the US or the Zionists. So you just can't have decency. And because if this goes against their interests, because of the system of nationalism and democracy, right, then we're not going to even have this person come in to allow this person to come in as a president or prime minister. And this is because of the system. And something very important you need to realize is how the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, he saw the wrongs of nationalism and tribalism, and we are living in the same times, like we said. And it's important you see the wrongs of this. And as Muslims, we have this understanding that this system is corrupt and this system is going to fall. And we know this. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make us a part of this change. So, just as the Sahaba realized, and they worked to stop injustice in the world, and how did they spread justice? Only a few years after Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam passed away, died, Islam spread from China, all the way from Makkah, Medina, all the way to China, all the way to the south of France. Just see how quickly, because the Muslims are spreading justice. So this is just a bit of a side discussion, but very important to realize the time, the education the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam is having at this time because of this war. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has chosen this for him because it's the most important thing he needs to do is abolish and this tribal, the system of Jahiliyyah, the system of borders. And so the thing is, now just going back to the battle, this final point for today, we're going to go back to the battle. What did the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam do during the battle? During this actual battle, the days of fighting that were happening, what did the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam do at this time? And the thing is, the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, he did not want to fight. He did not want to fight. Why? What was the reason why he did not want to fight? Because when the battle happened, on those 5 days, the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, now we said he's an older teenager, right? He's 18. This standoff started when he was 15. So he's 18. And in that culture at that time, even in our time, like in countries like the US and other countries, when you're 18 years old, you get recruited into the army. right? You get recruited, you have to fight for your country. Like, you get recruited into the military by the thousands because you're a certain age. You get signed up to, when there's a conflict going on, you have to join the military when you're 18. In places like we've said, at that time when the Prophet ﷺ was growing up, even being a 13 and 14-year-old meant you were still old enough to take part in battle. So even when you're 13, 14, you were considered old enough to join the military at 13, 14. In fact, you were expected to go and fight in battle as a 13 or 14-year-old. So just it was a sign why. It's a sign of your manhood. Like, you're supposed to love your tribe, love your country, the nationalism, you're supposed to be passionate about supporting dignity, the honor of your forefathers, your generations before. And of course, that's a bunch of nonsense, right? Like we just said, blindly supporting without justice. And Islam is against this, like we've said. But at that time of Jahiliyyah, it was sold. The poets were selling this through their media, right? If that's the media strategy, they were selling this idea. So, mainly through the media, through poetry, the mindset of the people is influenced. They start riling up together. And the Prophet ﷺ did not have any interest going into the battlefield. So even now, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he's put something into the Prophet ﷺ as an 18-year-old, like, I don't want to be a part of this. I don't want to be a part of this. It's not like a just cause. But the thing is, the uncles of the Prophet ﷺ, they were going out to battle. And they said to him, you have to come with us. You're old enough to take part. What are people going to say? What are people going to say? What are people going to say? Because uh, you are not a normal young man, right? You are the grandson of Abdul Muttalib. Abdul Muttalib, he's the greatest leader in the history of the Quraysh, our father, the greatest leader in the history of our people. How would he think if he knows my own son, my own grandson, did not take place in this battle? They see they're emotionally they're blackmailing the Prophet ﷺ, saying, how can that dare happen, right? What a disgrace to your family. What will people say? What will he think, if he was alive, if you did not go and fight in the battle? So you have got to come and take part in this battle, right? So what happened is the family of the Prophet ﷺ, the uncle, basically, they forced the Prophet ﷺ literally to go out into battle. And the Prophet ﷺ was basically able to, like, he avoided fighting the first 2 days. Like we said, this first 2 days of battle, he sort of avoided it. He avoided like fighting in those 2 days. He sort of avoided it. And when you're really, when you're forced to go somewhere, you don't want to be there. Of course, your heart's not going to be in it. So that's what it was. You can really relate to the situation. But the third day of fighting, Yawm Shard was the most fiercest day of fighting. The Prophet ﷺ was forced to go out with the uncles on this day. And actually, it talks about this, that even this is disputed. Some scholars dispute, like, did the Prophet ﷺ go out to battle or not? But, the scholars of the Seerah, of the Hadith, most of the scholars have said the Prophet ﷺ, the majority of the books say yes, he did go out to the battlefield. He was forced to go out. The uncles of the Prophet ﷺ forcefully took him out to the battlefield. So next session, inshallah, there's going to be one more session before the break, where we will conclude. We will see what the Prophet ﷺ actually did in the battlefield on the third day of the fiercest fighting, because what effect this conflict had on the Prophet ﷺ, and some more lessons for us. So just think, where we leave the session for today, the Prophet ﷺ does not want to be out there. His heart's not in it. He's forced to go out on the third day of battle. On the fiercest day of fighting, what does he do? Inshallah, we'll continue next week. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us the love of the Prophet ﷺ and really allow us to take benefit from his life, and really give us an eagerness to learn by the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Subhanaka Allahumma wa bihamdika nashhadu an la ilaha illa anta nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilaik.